Thanks very much, Andreas. And I have to say, so many familiar faces here. I think the world truly is shrinking. And I think a lot of familiar faces here. It could be good, could be bad. This crowd knows its business in terms of regulatory cooperation, so please no difficult questions at the beginning. As Andreas mentioned, this session is really meant to start with the basics, regulatory language, terminology, and hopefully this will serve to help frame the discussions that follow. Now, I should mention that one of the terms that I'm not going to be getting into is standards and standard setting, because I think Carolyn, we agreed, is going to be getting into that aspect, but of course it's all related. So I'm going to walk us through this, and just at the outset to say, you know, there is no one definition around any of these terms that everyone agrees with, and that's part of the problem. So you probably would recognize all of these terms, and again, it's not an exhaustive list, but do we have a common understanding of what we mean by even regulatory cooperation? When I was looking at the title for this workshop, International Regulatory Cooperation. What is international? Is that more than 2 countries? Is that regional? Is it beyond regional? Regulatory versus regulators versus regulation. Cooperation versus collaboration. What are we talking about there? So these are terms that we use and in the regulatory lexicon, but do we use them the same way? Do we have a common understanding around this? So why is this important? Well, as I mentioned, because there's no internationally harmonized, standardized, or consensus definitions around this. Compounded by the increasing numbers of terms, such as regulatory convergence, which are now thrown around and often used interchangeably by different parties, can lead to confusion and, more importantly, can set unrealistic or varying expectations in the minds of central agencies, in the minds of regulators, industry, consumers, and other vested stakeholders, and there are many in the arena of regulatory cooperation. So what I would say is an important potential outcome of this workshop is perhaps some common understanding around these terms. So what are the historical underpinnings shaping the language of regulation that begins really, as far as I could see, in earnest with the Industrial Revolution and the need for standards around such things as thread sizes for screws and other mechanical components? That, I think is fair to say, was accelerated exponentially in the 20th century with the rapid expansion of trade, technology, and a growing consumer population. So now you have goods that are not only within domestic borders, but are crossing borders, and you've got an increasing population that is consuming these products around the world. Some notable post-World War II events. In 1947, 2 events that are actually very important, the creation of the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, and the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which initially was looking at tariffs, but increasingly, as we know, anyone that's involved in trade negotiations, regulatory people are seen as technical barriers to trade now. So in 1994, a very important event, the Marrakesh Agreement on establishing the World Trade Agreement, and particularly important here is the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and the sanitary and phytosanitary agreements in defining member obligations. These are binding obligations in terms of trade that also lead into and are the foundation for government policy and terminology in the non-tariff arena. So this is where you're seeing now things such as standards, standardization, and harmonization actually being defined. And I'm glad to see Peter actually adding the EU on his slide. And I think this is, of course, a very important driver for harmonization, not only within Europe, but more broadly, initially with the creation of the European Economic Community in '57, the European Community in '67, and more recently, the European Union in 1993. Bringing this closer to home then, and the subject of this workshop, the internationalization of biomedical product regulation. And here, as anyone familiar with ICH and the drivers behind ICH, really the rapid increase in diversity of technical requirements witnessed in the 70s and 80s, coupled with, of course, and we've seen this on the slides already, globalization, increasing workloads for regulators, the complexity of products and processes and technology, rising development costs, and a more informed and risk-averse public. And while initially and still motivated by trade and trade agreements, increasingly there is a desire to cooperate on the part of regulatory authorities and other players, such as funding organizations, NGOs, etc. So previously, regulators really were looking at products, approving products, and things that happened within their borders. As of certainly the 80s, that has changed dramatically. So we have been pulled into the lexicon of regulatory cooperation and the language around this. And that has led to a world of harmonization initiatives. And again, here I've got the EU in the center because I think we can learn from the experiences that the member states went through and the thinking that transpired to come to a single market, and thinking not as member states, but scientifically and pan-European. So here we've got, of course, some of the major, but not, again, not a comprehensive list of harmonization initiatives. So on the second slide, I had a lot of terms, too many to cover in a few minutes, but I think there are some important terms that merit a little further discussion. And the first is, what do we mean by international regulatory cooperation? Well, here is a working definition. Inter-country activities carried out with a view to improving national regulatory outcomes and promoting convergence. Now here, this could be bilateral, it could be multilateral. It occurs at all stages of the regulatory life cycle. And here, this could be from policy development, assessment of new or existing regulations, through program implementation, and finally review and evaluation of programs. And it includes a wide range of undertakings such as information sharing, collaborative scientific work, developing common or international standards, and we'll be talking a lot about this, and the Holy Grail, perhaps, work sharing. And this is adapted from a Government of Canada document that was put out in April of 2006. I think the thing I would want to mention here is the first bullet, and the fact that we're not undertaking regulatory cooperation for its own sake. In fact, it has to contribute to public health. So improving national regulatory outcomes becomes extremely important in this discussion. What about harmonization? We don't even agree on how to spell this or perhaps how to pronounce it. And we've discussed this many times in ICH. Well, spent part of my weekend looking at some definitions. You pull out Oxford, Webster, Wikipedia, you know, what are the common definitions around harmonization? Well, really, bringing into harmony, agreement, accord. So this is a common dictionary usage. And maybe we can see from this, looking forward, some of the flexibilities inherent in this. So this is more in the field of music, saying you're not necessarily singing the same note, but it's in harmony. Okay, so it's agreeable. Looking at the United States pharmacopoeia and pharmacopoeial harmonization, and here it talks about, in fact, yielding the same results. So you could have different monographs. The European Pharmacopoeia, the United States Pharmacopoeia, the Japanese Pharmacopoeia, they've been undertaking this harmonization process for some time. It doesn't mean the text is exactly the same, but it means you come to the same end result if you test it in the same decision. And the one that I think we really need to pay some attention to is the last one, which is a definition from the World Trade Organization SPS agreement, and that is the establishment, recognition, and application of common measures by different members or jurisdictions. So looking at those terms, firstly, again, not one single understanding about what harmonization means, but what are some of the considerations that we will be discussing today and tomorrow? Certainly, harmonization by any definition is a key enabler for enhanced cooperation. We can't think as regulators or regulated industry of a regulatory cooperation if our standards and approaches are wildly different. And harmonization may occur at different levels, technical requirements such as ICH guidelines, but increasingly now we're getting into the realm of harmonization around procedures and processes. And in certain instances, perhaps even laws and regulations. It's simple in concept, but much more difficult in execution. And as we've seen, the gold standard really remains the International Conference on Harmonization. So what are some of the keys to success around this in ICH? Well, you have a number of bullets here, but I think the last two are particularly important. Limited number of players with comparable regulatory and technical capability, and a commitment of regulators to implement the products of harmonization. And we'll see why this is important in contrasting it with another harmonization initiative. So, adoption, adaption, implementation. What do these mean? Are they the same? I would say no. And again, we've discussed this ad nauseum at ICH steering committees. Adoption, the official administrative incorporation of a guidance or a standard into the regulatory framework as is, no changes. Whether we interpret it the same way at the end of the day, that could be different. Adoption, deliberate changes, additions, restrictions, which may or may not respect the principles of the source document. And finally, implementation, the true measure of harmonization. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the ICH product lifecycle, guidance documents, on the left you have what happens within ICH, the ICH step process. Step 4, sign off by the steering committee, it becomes an ICH guidance. Great, then what happens? It has to be integrated into the regulatory framework. It is a regulatory obligation at that point in time. And first is to adopt it. It becomes an FDA guideline. It becomes a Health Canada guideline. It becomes a CHMP guideline. But is it truly implemented? And I would say that not necessarily, because you have to consider all of these issues to say that at the end of the day, it is fully implemented. Do you have the regulatory authority? Is there the need, for example, with the Common Technical Document, to integrate this into filing requirements and collateral policy and guidance work? Scope of application to generics, to new drugs, to biologics, to vaccines, training, competencies, infrastructure for the E-standards, for MEDRA, inherent complexity of products, readiness of industry, and resources. Unless you've got all of this covered, you can't say at the end of the day you've truly implemented a guidance. And this is meant to just depict that on the left-hand side you have a finalized guidance, but it has, again, to be integrated into a regulatory system. PANDRA, on the other hand, stands for the Pan American Network on Drug Regulatory Harmonization, established to promote pharmaceutical regulatory harmonization and capacity building within the Americas. From the start, a recognition here of pre-existing asymmetries within the hemisphere. So you have the most advanced countries globally, or some of the most advanced countries, and some of the least advanced or developed countries on the planet. Characteristics, and we'll be hearing more from James Fitzgerald from PAHO on this later, organized into 5 sub-regional economic blocks, much broader mandate, more players with greater diversity and capacity and needs. So here we have a different definition of harmonization, understood to be the search for common ground within the framework of recognized standards, taking into account the existence of different political, economic, and health realities amongst the countries of the region. Now, regulatory convergence. So we've heard that term a number of times. And actually, the definition of harmonization that we just saw under the Pan-American Network really speaks to what APEC and now other groups have defined as regulatory convergence. It represents a process whereby regulatory requirements across economies or countries become more aligned over time as a result of the adoption of internationally recognized technical guidances, standards, and best practices. Importantly here, it does not require the harmonization of laws and regulations. Will, for example, Canada and the US harmonize our laws and regulations? Not in my lifetime. But does that mean that we can't make meaningful progress in terms of regulatory cooperation? Of course it does not. This means that we have a broader concept than harmonization, and a good example here would be good review practices, where you have essential elements. Not every agency will approach it the same way, but they're equivalent. And it's also looking forward, making best efforts. On that, what does equivalence mean? Two or more systems are said to be equivalent if, despite differences, they are expected to produce the same outcomes. Should be established through objective means and documented. And here, perhaps the best examples are mutual recognition agreements relating to GMPs. And this tries to tie it all together, the regulatory cooperation continuum, where on the left-hand side you have the development of standards, common standards. You can, from that, between authorities, assess equivalence. This can lead to enhanced forms of cooperation, and then there's a feedback loop. So convergence is a dynamic process, and catalysts you see at the bottom here. Two new terms that I would propose as part of this dialogue, pharmacoverging and interconnectivity. The first coming from a dear colleague of mine, Captain Justina Molzon from CEDAR US FDA. And components here, pharma pertaining to pharmaceuticals, code together, jointly, mutually, verging, being on the edge or margin of something, the limit beyond which something begins to happen. If you want to promote change, you may need to change the vocabulary. So very in alignment with the regulatory convergence. Interconnectivity, we heard this theme already. This comes from a recommendation from the 13th ICTRA conference. Who should promote the principle of interconnectivity, information sharing and cooperation between harmonization initiatives and enabling organizations such as the World Health Organization in order to build synergies, leverage capacity, and sustain efforts. And I'll end with this. Previously we had a slide where it was kind of like the exploding universe, but perhaps we are coming closer together. We need to build those synergies and become a true global regulatory village speaking a common language. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. So I learned that convergence is more the process and harmonization is maybe more the goal. Is that a very simplistic way of looking at it?
Sorry, hit mute. I think we could probably debate that in a few minutes. I probably agree with some of that.
Okay. Good. The next speaker is Carolyn Compton. Carolyn is a pathologist by training, I saw, with a very distinguished academic career, so you must have had deep insights into the human mind on this side. Now you are at the Critical Path Initiative, and I'm glad that I have this role here because it made me look up what Critical Path Initiative is, and I've been playing with words here. It's on the cutting edge of science between the my understanding, between the industry and the regulators, the place where they can meet and where they can discuss how to take the process of making better and more efficient regulatory decision happen.